So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We will start with a new novel today, which happens to be Akin Narayan's novel, The Guide. Now, before we dive into the novel, which we will in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about the context of the novel, because that's what we're doing in this course. We are looking at the relationship between the text and the context. We just finished Heart of Darkness, and before that, we finished other novels as well. And in each of the novels we studied so far, you remember that we are looking at the relationship between the societal conditions, the societal changes, the cultural changes, and how all those changes are getting reflected in the text, the production of the plot that the novels are using or espousing. Now, Narayan, of course, is one of the most important figures in early 20th century Indian writing in English. So, if you look at the history of Indian writing in English, it of course starts with Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rajmohan's wife, but it is only in the sort of early 20th century that it really picks up. So we have these really big figures at that time, Raja Rao, Akin Narayan, and other people who come after that, right? So the whole idea of Mukharajan, of course, so the whole idea of looking at Indian writing in English as a big cultural moment, a big literary moment, really takes place from early 20th century. And the novel we will study, particularly for this course, which is a guide, is really a profound novel when it comes to examining the different kinds of social, cultural, political, and moral changes happening in India in the early 20th century. There are lots of symbols in a novel. The characters, of course, fascinating. We have the idea of the guru, the guide, in the character of Raju, who is a bit of a rogue hero, actually, a bit of an anti hero. There's also some kind of a interesting representation of the classical guru culture, the classical teacher culture. And the ambivalence around that is really interesting because you never quite know towards the end of the novel whether Raju actually acquires enlightenment or does he conduct or does he perform one last con act, because he's a bit of a con man really throughout the novel. We see that he is someone who is really trying to make quick money, because this is a time in India with the markets they're opening is getting more and more plugged into the global markets, as it were. And tourism is picking up. Railways, of course, become a very important part. The entire collusion between the railway industry and the tourism industry, and how the arrival of railways really begin to change not just the physical landscape, but also the moral landscape of Indian towns. Now, of course, some of you know this already, that Narayan really depicts a fictional town of Malgudi. There's no such place called Malgudi for real, but there are all kinds of speculations what Malgudi may be. Uh, for general scholarship, they assume Malgudi to be in and around the area of what we call Mysore today, right? So there is that fictional chronotop that Narayan keeps representing in his novels. And of course, what it allows him to do is to really fictionalize the real historical changes that we see happening, particularly in the guide, where the arrival of railways, the arrival of the tourism industry, the arrival of the new market of consumerism and capital, all these factors, they all come together to create a new kind of financial as well as moral economy, so that constant traffic between morality and finance, the new orders of morality, the changing orders of morality, and the changing orders of finance. So these become very important aspects when we look at Narayan's writing. So as I mentioned already, that when you use the word economy in Narayan's writing, we have to use it in a very entangled, as a very entangled concept, because economy here entails moral economy, financial economy, cultural economy, and how also the linguistic economy, the language markers begin to change as well. So the guide is one of the really interesting novels, really, very objectively speaking, when it comes to examining the relationship between human conditions and the changing social conditions, and how the latter, which is the changing social conditions and the moral ecology or the finance ecology, it all begins to shape and reshape the human character, human decisions, human cognition in many ways. And of course, as I mentioned already, that there is some kind of a rewriting of the guru culture. There's some kind of You can call it satire, you can call it critique, you can call it some kind of a reconstruction maybe. We don't quite know, and that is the ambivalence in the end, that interpretative ambivalence, the interpretative indeterminacy in the end, where you don't quite know what really happens when Raju almost falls at his feet and says that to Velan, that he can feel in a very visceral way that the rains are coming, and that's where the novel ends. And we don't know the rains really come or not. We don't know whether Raju, like I said, performs one more con man's show. We don't quite know. And that ambiguity, that interpretative ambiguity at the end of the novel, is what makes it so complex, so fascinating, because this is in India, this is a newly emerging nation state where all kinds of identity markers become very complex and very, very deconstructive in quality, where the shift from the static, stable ontology to a mutable ontology, when it comes to ontology of identities, ontology of economy, ontology of moral vocabulary. So all that shift has taken place in the novel. So in many sense, it is one of the most powerful novels to study if you want to examine the relationship between human behavior, human identities, human decisions, human morality, and the changing notion of the marketplace in early 20th century India. So that's the long and short of course, we'll spend more time looking at the changing societal conditions of 20th century India, which is reflected in Narayan's novel. But this is just to give you a primer in terms of how we will study, how we aim to study this particular novel. So on your screen, there's an essay, a really interesting essay by Alpana Sharma Knipling, where there's a contrast or some kind of a comparison between Raja Rao and R.K. Narayan. And of course, the real thrust area of the essay is looking at the modern English discourse in colonial India. So what happens to language? What happens to the changing notions of language, the changing vocabulary, really, in this sort of modern, emerging, aspirational India, the post-colonial India in some sense, right? Because this novel is written, when India obviously becomes a nation state on its own, but there is this massive aspirational economy, and in many senses, a very new country. So that tension and sometimes collusion between ancientness and newness is something we find happening again and again in R.K. Narayan's writing, especially in the Guide, where, as I mentioned, there are these ancient archetypes which are reused: the idea of the guru, the spiritual teacher, the enlightened person, etc. So all those archetypes are reused, but at the same time, they're also plucked into the newly emerging aspirational economy, the newly emerging market vocabulary that India is finding herself gravitating towards, because it's a new country with an ancient attribute, right? So that tension, which is also collaboration, sometimes gets really interestingly represented in Narayan's writing, not least in this novel, The Guide. So Alpana Sharma Knipling writes this really interesting essay called R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, and Modern English Discourse in Colonial India. And this is published in one of the finest journals in the field, Modern Fiction Studies. And this should be on your screen. So let's take a look at the beginning of the essay, where it gives you some sense of the historicity of Indian writing in English. The historical beginnings, of course, it started with the famous or infamous the Macmillan Minutes, which was designed really to create this breed of Indians really who would speak English, write English, and essentially serve as bureaucrats, the in-between men, as it were, who would help the British govern the country better. So it wasn't really a benevolent mission. It was more of a strategic mission, a strategic action plan, as it were. The Macmillan, the mission of educating English to Indians, just so they become the right kind of people to act as the link between the governed and the governor. Of course, in writing in English can be traced back to that moment, and where more and more writers started writing in English. Of course, when it comes to, by the time we come to Narayan and Raja Rao and Mukraj Anand, there is very much the emergence of unique Indian writing in English, right, which is not necessarily the same as British English or American English. It is beginning to carve a unique and very complex and very rich identity of its own. And of course, by the time we come to someone like Salman Rushdie, we have a complete polyphony of this new language, the Indian English language, where it is sort of plugged into Hindi, plugged into Bollywood, plugged into all kinds of local registers as well, which Rushdie, of course, calls by this fascinating term, chutnification. This entire hybridity of language, the polyphony of language, the asymmetric entanglements of different kinds of linguistic registers, which celebrate impurity, which celebrate heterogeneity, which celebrate the sort of carnivalesque, polyphonic politics of writing. But as Sharma Nipling reminds us, and this should be on your screen, indigenous Indian novel writing in English dates back to at least the mid-19th century. Its origin owes as much to the educational reforms called by both the 1813 Charter Act and the ensuing 1835 English Education Act of William Bentinck as to the circulation, representation, and purchase of English literature and culture among members of the Indian upper classes in the 19th century India. So again, the 1835, Bentinck governed, colonial empire in India, which wanted to create or wanted to sort of people internalize the superiority or the cultural supremacy or the cultural artifacts and verticals of English, really. So which is why Shakespeare started to be taught in many Indian universities around that time. So as you can see, the circulation, representation, and purchase, so it becomes some kind of a commodity. English literature begins to become a commodity in the Indian market, of course, with a political motive, a political mission, which is to make Indians internalize that as some kind of an artifact like culture, artifact like quality. So while we are not at liberty to assume that novel production in Britain and colonial India underwent simply parallel routes, we may still argue for the possibility, in the case of English writing in India, of a nascent space in which British and Indian social codes and value systems began to intersect and mutually determine one another. So again, there's a lot of intersections and convergences going on. So I just mentioned, for instance, the arrival of railways in sleepy Indian towns like Malgudi, the fictional chronotop that Narayan offers. But even that, when you see something as material as the arrival of railways, arrival of train for the matter, the massive cultural change that takes place, right after the cultural, economic, social, political, economic changes that take place, because the railways, of course, creates or generates a very unique economy of its own in terms of the tea shops and coffee shops and different kinds of markets which open around the railway centers, which obviously correspond to this very episodic arrival and departure of trains. So you can see at the level of time too, the level of temporality too, there's a lot of changes taking place, because from this sort of leisurely, long drawn out temporal structures, we have more episodic structures where the entire rhythm of the town, the entire mercantile rhythm or human rhythm of the town, they rely heavily on the arrival of departures of trains. So the timetable of the trains, for instance, they shape and reshape and profoundly govern the sequences and the schemata, really, the temporal schemata, as it were, of those towns, right? So the entire temporality or the divisions, the markers of temporality in those towns are determined by train metaphors, right? So the timetable of the train and the cultural, social behavior and actions of those towns, they correspond to each other in very complex ways. So at a very theoretical, philosophical level, what that means is the idea, the sense, the experience of time begins to change. And you can see how even at a almost neural cognitive quality or threshold, we begin to see that change happen in a very, very interesting way, perhaps permanent way as well. So there is this episodicity, the episodic quality, which is very much there with the arrival and departure of trains. So that's the intersection that is being hinted at over here. So more specifically, the translation of certain progressive British social codes and cultural values of the Enlightenment into Indian terms entailed something like a new episteme, a new knowledge network, episteme being a knowledge network, knowledge structure, within whose rigor Indian writers started to produce novels assuming a critical stance towards what were now conceived as backward Indian social and cultural practices, right? So there's this critique that is very much there, especially in Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand, and Akin Narayan's writing, where the assumption that Indian social structures are backward, the assumption that Indian moral structures are backward, so that assumption is critiqued, and ironically and appropriately, using the language of the colonizer, right? So that is quite literally the empire writing back, the empire critiquing back. So there is a sense of subversion that is taking place, quite literally. I mentioned Bankim Chandra, and there's a reference to Bankim Chandra's novel as well, Rajmohan's Wife. So Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's 1864 novel, Rajmohan's Wife, for instance, utilizes a social reformer's zeal in its depiction of a middle-class Hindu woman's abuse by her husband. However, by the early 20th century, many writers began to insist on the Indian content of the material, an increasingly prevalent tendency, no doubt, informed by the corresponding rise of nationalism and all the organized movements of civil disobedience. So, as you can see, the reason why I chose this essay is it really gives you a very fair picture, a very fair flavor, really, in terms of how the rise of the Indian writing in English, particularly the novel, should be seen, should be historicized, should be situated with the different directions that the freedom movements were taking place, the nationalisms, the new networks, the new narratives of nationalism were taking place. So there is that really interesting correspondence going on over here between different organized movements in politics and culture, and how the different narratives of novel writing at that time were connected to that, were plugged into that political discourse. So Narayan, of course, inhabits that tradition, and it is within the folds of this complex history that we may understand the imbrications of the discourses of nationalism, colonialism, and modernity in the Indian colonial context. All these big things, the big issues over here, nationalism, colonialism, and modernity, should be understood only in relation to their correspondence to the different cultural, social changes that were taking place at that time. So there is that cusp of change happening around the time in which these people were writing, Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand, and Raja Rao. So they both depict the point of time, the slice of time right before independence, as well as the point of time right after independence. So that 10, 20 years before and after, that liminal gray zone is something which gets represented again and again in the fiction of this time. So I would argue now what the writer says over here. She sort of gives you a diachronic idea in terms of how Indian writing in English may be studied and situated. I would argue that in order to effectively read early Indian literature in English for the purpose of this essay, early signifies the period of the 1930s and 40s. That's what is meant by early 1930s and 40s. One needs to see how, in this period, the alliance of nationalism and colonialism produced India's modern moment, right? So the like I said, the temporality, the cultural moment of modern India was through the alliance of nationalism and colonialism. So the whole idea of breaking away from the shackles of imperialism, breaking away from the tyranny of colonialism, and the different nationalist discourses which are prevalent at the time to make that departure happen. So that is the Zeitgeist, that is a cultural momentum, as it were, which gets represented in Indian writing in English. That acknowledgement of that presence should be there, and even the most superficial reading of this fiction, this subset of fiction. So, and this is what is meant by modernity. So the idea of modernity in India is quite complex because it sort of includes pre-colonial as well as the post-colonial. So there is a very big temporal shading that is happening over here. By shading, I mean integration of different components. And shading obviously means, if you use the sort of metaphor of art and painting, the mixing of colors, as it were, the mixing of different kinds of flavors, different kinds of content, different kinds of priorities and impetus. So, indeed, the uneven terrain of Indian colonial history, on which numerous nationalist struggles for independence were played out in the mid to late 19th century, yields nothing more startling than a picture of this very alliance between nationalism and colonialism, which in a sense secured India's modernity in the early 20th century. So India's modernity, of course, is a very complex cultural condition, and there's a sense of you know, coming together of opposites, as it were, in Indian modernity, which is why it is such a difficult thing to define. It's not really modernity in a European sense, because there is both nostalgia as well as aspiration in Indian modernity. So there is looking back, it's a pre-colonial past, which also gets integrated, as well as the aspiration of a post-colonial nation. So both get really interestingly connected to what we call Indian modernity, which is why it is so different from the idea of European modernity. It is far more complex, far more heterogeneous, and far more textual and palimpsestic in quality. However, the alliance of nationalism and colonialism will not seem quite so startling if you remember that both these ideological formations had a shared stake in the larger Western bourgeois discourse of progressive liberal humanism, emerging as a symptom of modernity in the 1930s and 40s. So there is that spectral presence of progressive liberal humanism, which is there in the idea of modernity, but of course it's much more complex than that. In the studies of the strategic exclusion of the subaltern from national narratives of emancipation, such Indian Marxist historians and theorists such as subaltern studies historians and Gayatri Spivak have pointed out that nationalism or the organized resistance to imperialism will itself always participate in the cultural aspects of imperialism, as long as an organized resistance to imperialism is a bourgeois movement, right? So there is that critique of imperialism or resistance to imperialism, how it can sometimes be a very, very upper caste, upper class privileged position to take. So there is that tension as well. It was really inclusive in that sense. And some of that critique also gets directed to Indian writing in English. If you look at the writers writing at the time, Narayan Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand, they all come from very elite backgrounds in some sense by contemporary standards. And that elitism, that privileged position, the privileged perspective is something that is also there in their writing. Okay, now we'll skip a little bit and come to the last bit of this page where there's reference to Narayan and Rao and how the writings may be compared and contrasted in very interesting ways. So R.K. Narayan and Raja Rao, two early Indian writers in English, productively demonstrate how the literary project participated in the modern moment inaugurated by the complicitous embrace of the discourses of nationalism and colonialism. So the complicity or the complicitous quality of nationalism and colonialism is something which we find quite strongly in both Raja Rao and R.K. Narayan's writing. So the important thing over here is the idea of what is meant by complicitous, right? Because the idea of complicity or being collusive or being collaborative is something which we have to unpack while reading Narayan's writing. So, the two novels mentioned over here, Narayan's The English Teacher and Rao's Kantapura. Now, it's a very interesting choice because English Teacher, of course, as you can see, here is this McCullough man. Here is someone who's read English, learned English, wants to pass it on, through the reading of Shakespeare and Dickens and all the rest of it. So there is that very, very strong colonial legacy or colonial action plan, which is getting embodied in the presence and the figuration of the English teacher. And you contrast that with Raja Rao's Kantapura, which again is a fictional town, but it is very much in sort of historically located in the Gandhian movements and non-cooperation at that time, right? So the resistance against the British in non-violent ways. So there is that idea of colonialism and the need to break the shackles of colonialism, but at the same time, there's this newly emerging nation with its entire economy of aspirations and ambitions and fears and anxieties, and all that gets represented in very, very interesting ways in these two novels. Now, Narayan's The English Teacher and Rao's Kantapura, English Teacher written in 1945, Kantapura written in 1938, are novels produced at a time when the most volatile position themselves vis-a-vis British colonialism and Indian nationalism. So there is this volatility, this episodic quality, this mutability which is there. And again, that's interesting for us to remember because the novel itself lends that the mutable, the mosaic of different kinds of movements, different kinds of moods, different kinds of momentum, right? And that mutability, that mosaic of movements, is exactly what makes a novel so attractive to these writers at that time. And that platform can also accommodate the tension or the collusion between nationalism and imperialism and colonialism. But with the exception of Waiting for the Mahatma, neither colonialism nor nationalism occupies a central position in Narayan's novels of this, or for the matter, any later period. Now, if you remember, one of the things I may have mentioned at the beginning of this course, that when we read society through literature, when we read culture through literature, we have to pay equal attention to what is not represented in fiction and in the plot. And sometimes, in fact, what is not represented becomes more important than what is represented, right? So the idea of the absence, or the figuration of the absence, or the articulation of the absence becomes very important while we read really good works of fiction, or poetry for the matter, right? So why is it, the obvious question is, why is it that colonialism or nationalism don't occupy central positions in Narayan's writings, but very peripheral positions, and sometimes they come in tangentially, but they never really become the primary tropes or the primary verticals in Narayan's fictions or fiction. So, conversely, questions regarding colonialism and nationalism do occupy a large part of Raja Rao's Kantapura, but they are treated in such a way that they are deferred rather than addressed. So there is this sense of deferral in Raja Rao's writing. So there is an addressing of colonialism and nationalism, but it's an inadequate, almost lethargic address, right? So it's not really a direct address. And there's a sense of procrastination in that kind of writing, which again, of course, is quite strategic. We're not saying this as a critique of Rao or Narayan. So why does it get procrastinated? Why is there a delay in describing or depicting the entanglement of colonialism and nationalism? So the deferred address is important for us to notice. In both Narayan's The English Teacher and Rao's Kantapura, then aspects of colonialism and nationalism are engaged in a sidewise fashion, indirectly and obliquely. So, if you look at someone like Salman Rushdie, modern reading of Rushdie, he encourages the idea of reading sideways rather than reading directly or reading in a linear sequential fashion. So the preference to read sideways rather than sequentially is important, because sideways reading can help us integrate incompatible elements, right? So the idea of incompatibility begins to become, uh, addressed. So what are the incompatible readings, incompatible interpretations? Even those could be woven in very interesting readings of a novel. So there's an indirectness, an obliqueness, and of course sideways reading habits, which are being encouraged by the very nature and plot of these novels, because, as I mentioned, there are some very tangential references to some very burning questions at the time. So very oblique references, very, very peripheral, sometimes almost superficial references to some really burning, pressing issues of the time. And obviously the question is why? So why are these pressing issues? Why are these questions about representation, nationalism, colonialism not taken head on by these writers? So what is going on really in terms of the artistic choice or the narrative choice to not foreground that element? So again, these decisions are both artistic as well as political, right? So there is this strategic situatedness which is going on in terms of what you situate, what you resituate, right? And the politics of situatedness, the interplay of the situated, resituated, and desituated become really important in Narayan and Rao's fiction. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, some of them are writing about ancient attributes using a new vocabulary, and that the tension, the collaboration between ancientness and newness is what makes this writing, the subset of literature, so fascinating in quality. So we'll stop at this point and we'll continue with this essay in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.